The sky hasn't been blue in years. It hangs above us like a ceiling of ash, muted and heavy, as though the heavens themselves collapsed under the weight of what we've done. Some mornings it glows a sickly orange. Other times it's the color of bruised steel. Clouds don't form the way they used to. When they gather, they come in thick, choking veils of dust or poisonous storms that sting the skin and blind the eyes. You learn not to hope for rain anymore. Rain isn't water. Rain is black, acidic, and strips the flesh from the unprepared. I remember once, long ago, children dancing in puddles after spring showers. Now, if a storm comes, people dive for cover, scramble for anything to shield themselves, and pray the droplets don't burn holes through their clothes, or worse, their skin. Hope for rain became fear of it, and in that shift, something fundamental in us died. The ground mirrors the sky, broken, cracked, unrecognizable. Fields that once fed millions are deserts of splintered clay, fractured into deep scars that stretch for miles. Where wheat once swayed golden in the summer wind, there are only brittle stalks of thorn and scrub that claw at your legs if you walk too close. The rivers are long gone. What remains of them are dry beds littered with the bones of fish that suffocated in silence, their bodies turned to dust long before the last trickles of water disappeared. Cities, too, are ghosts of themselves. Towers still stand, but they lean like drunks who've lost their way, glass shattered, steel skeletons rusting. Once, lights from those buildings could be seen from miles away, glowing as if humanity had captured the stars. Now they are hollow monoliths, filled with shadows and scavengers picking clean the last scraps of civilization. Shopping malls echo with the crunch of glass underfoot, shelves stripped bare decades ago. Suburban houses lie in rows, collapsed like dominoes, roofs sagging in on themselves, the woods swollen from years of acid storms and neglect. There are no governments anymore, not in the way people once knew them. The nations fractured quickly after the disasters began compounding, after crops failed and seas rose to devour the coasts. Leaders made promises they couldn't keep, and when those promises dissolved, so did the idea of order. What exists now are fragments, warlords controlling pockets of resources, survivor enclaves bound by fragile trust, and roving bands of scavengers who take what they want from the weak. Sometimes you hear whispers of an organized council somewhere far north, people clinging to the dream of rebuilding. But those are just rumors. And in this world, rumors are dangerous. They make you move when you should stay put, hope when you should harden. The old institutions are nothing but relics. Schools, burned down or looted for their timber. Hospitals, empty shells where broken glass crunches under your boots, and the scent of old chemicals still lingers. The libraries have fared no better. Fire took most, mold took the rest. Knowledge has become a rare currency, something guarded more tightly than water. Survivor groups dot the landscape like embers trying not to burn out. Some cling together in the ruins of old cities, building barricades, trading scraps of canned food, and whatever clean water they can filter. Others wander, carrying their entire lives on their backs. Trust is rare. People will walk beside you for a day, maybe a week, and then vanish in the night with whatever you've got left in your bag. Still, against all odds, some groups thrive. Small bands who learn to trap, to farm with what poisoned soil will allow, or to recycle the bones of the old world into something resembling survival. Then there are the raiders, the desperate and the cruel. They thrive on violence, on stripping others of the little they have. You can hear them sometimes at night, engines roaring in the distance, scavenged vehicles growling like beasts as they hunt. If you hear them too close, you hide. If they see you, you run. If they catch you, well, few people live to tell what happens next. But the land itself, the very air, is our most merciless enemy. Heat waves kill faster than bullets. Some summers, the ground gets so hot it warps metal and melts plastic. Winters aren't any kinder. Violent swings of cold that split the skin open and freeze what little water remains in cracked canisters. The seasons have become weapons, unpredictable and cruel, and no one can adapt fast enough. Familiar landmarks are unrecognizable. The great rivers of the Midwest are deserts of salt and bone. The coasts are gone, swallowed whole by the rising oceans decades ago, leaving only jagged lines of drowned skyscrapers poking through the waves like broken teeth. Forests burned, and the ashes carried on the wind for years. Animals, the ones that remain, are twisted echoes of their former selves. Smaller, leaner, feral, desperate, like us. Birds rarely sing anymore. Their silence is louder than any storm. There's no certainty left, no guarantee that the world won't turn on you tomorrow. Every day is an unspoken gamble. Will the air choke you with dust? Will the food you scavenged rot before you can eat it? Will the people you meet share their fire or slit your throat? The weight of that uncertainty presses on you every hour, every step. Even in silence you can feel it, like a storm building just out of sight waiting to strike. Still, here we are. Humanity clings to the edges of this broken earth, thin threads of survival stretching against the void. The cities may be husks, the rivers gone, the skies poisoned, but people endure, stubborn and unwilling to let go, as though survival itself is a rebellion against the ruin. Maybe that's all that's left of us now, the refusal to die quietly in a world that wants us gone. Not a family, not a job title, not even a face many remember, just a voice that comes on the radio when the static is thin and someone, somewhere, needs proof that another human breathed in the same poisoned air today. I used to think voices were small things, easy to lose under the noise of a city, easy to ignore. Now they are lifelines. I keep mine alive because someone once kept one for me. My name is Jonah. Once, I was an engineer who fixed things most people no longer thought about. The pipes under the street, the hum of transformers, the comforting certainty that power would arrive if you turned the switch. That training saved me. You learn to look at a broken thing and ask 3 steady questions. What is it doing? What should it do? And what does it need to try again? Those 3 questions are how I survive. They are how I coax a battered transmitter into throwing my voice across the ash sky so a handful of radios can find me. Survival is equal parts stubbornness and chores. In the mornings I check the generator, ears pressed to metal, hands learning the language of leaks and knocks. My generator is ancient, cobbled from a tractor motor and the guts of a hospital UPS. It runs on a blend of scavenged diesel and synthetic alcohol. I distill from spoiled fruit and fermented scraps. Distillation is an art and a danger. One careless spark, and years of careful stock go up in heat, and a lesson in how quickly hope can burn. I ration the fuel down to the minute. Every second the radio breathes is a second I must pay for with sweat and scavenged parts. Water is the math that decides everything. I keep a solar still array on the roof, old satellite dishes bent into shallow pans, plastic sheeting stretched tight, a single glass bottle to collect condensation. It gives me a litre or 2 a day in good weather, less when the sky is a furnace. I have a hand pump for an old well 2 blocks over. It coughs up brown water that tastes of iron and old money, but with charcoal filtration and a long boil it's safe enough. I know how to read a creek's memory, where the stones are polished, where plants still lurk in damp hollows. I've learned to dig cisterns under the roots of dead elms, small holes that catch what little the winds drag down at night. These are not glamorous things. They are slow work and often thankless. Still, they keep me breathing. Food is barter and ingenuity. I trade batteries for jars of canned fruit I found months ago, smoking fish over a captured propane tank, seeds tucked in the folds of my jacket waiting for a place that will accept the risk of planting. I keep a few tins of old military rations for company and emergency. A small metallic reminder that once, systems were built to be expected. I can mend a bolt and fashion a hook, but I can also break down a squirrel carcass and smoke the meat for a week. There's a dignity in that now, using the whole animal, saving the bone for broth. I cut open an orange and remember a childhood window, and for a second a laugh rises up like a reflex, then drops because the laugh is expensive and I spend it carefully. People ask why I do the radio if it costs fuel and attention. The answer is that the radio is the only place where the word we still has weight. When I speak, strangers answer. I get messages pressed into envelopes and nailed to the mast of an abandoned fire tower, notes left in hollowed-out books in ruined libraries, voices that come back over the air in rasping, hopeful static. Sometimes it's a woman who has 3 children and a broken leg asking where to find iodine. Sometimes it's a group of teenagers who think the word future doesn't have to be a joke. Once, a man called to tell me he had found a school with a solar array still working and invited anyone within range to come. People hang on those calls like lifelines. Loss is the ballast in my chest. My sister Lena didn't make it through the first months. We had argued over whether to leave the city when the flood sirens went off, and I chose pipes and pumps, foolish, fixable things, while she chose to gather the rest of our neighbors and walk. I can still hear her voice in the static sometimes, a half memory that arrives between frequencies, sharp, practical, incapable of pretending. I replay the argument until the edges go dull, like sharpening the same blade until even the handle loses meaning. I keep one photograph folded under the transmitter. Two people in an old kitchen, sunlight on the table. It's ragged and curled, but at night I unfold it and let the faces exist for a while. There are nights when loneliness is so loud, I could cut it with a screwdriver. I used to sleep with the radio off to keep from listening to others' grief. Now I sleep with it tuned low, the hum and the occasional cough of a distant voice for company. You become both anchor and confession box. People tell me things on air that they will not tell each other. Confessions and bargaining. The small details of survival that are map and warning both. A man once called in to say he'd watched the last of his livestock die in a single afternoon. He was quiet until I asked him what color the sky had been. The color of the sky matters. It's the code for what to do next. I listened to him breathe, and then we spoke about seed swaps and how to mend a leaky roof. We were practical and human for 5 minutes. That saved us both. I am skilled at being alone, but not proud of it. There are scars on my hands from raids, from scavenging runs that went wrong. Once, a group followed me off the road, clever and cold, and they took what they wanted. 2 solar panels, a box of copper wire. They left me the broadcast tower and a threat. The tower is hard to rebuild alone. I learned then to move quietly, to leave traps. Nothing lethal, just noisy, designed to warn. Trust is a ledger you never balance. If someone stays more than a day, I watch how they fix things, how they treat my small animals, if they ration their smiles. People who can smile in this world are either blessed or dangerous. Hope, for me, is not a big thing. It is small and concrete. The solder that bonds a broken lead. The seed that sprouts between concrete slabs. The note left under a rock that says, "We survived last night." My duty feels like a small rebellion against the erasure that wants to quiet us. When I send a message, weather reports, where to find clean water, warnings about roving bands, or just a remembered song, what I'm doing, inside, is pointing at a fact. You are not alone. It's a shallow truth, but it keeps us human. Sometimes the memory of the old world comes back unbidden. A train station that smelled of coffee and newspapers. The rush of people who had someplace to be. Those memories are soft and sharp at once, making the contrast with the present sting. Yet those memories also teach me something vital. People were once capable of organizing, of building systems that worked for many. If we can survive, we can assemble small systems again. Not governments maybe, but networks. A radio network is a start. A traded battery is a promise. A garden behind a boarded-up school is a contract with tomorrow. There are moments when I dream of a place where the sky is a little less knife-like, where children can play without masks on their faces and the water is not a calculation of risk. I don't know if that place exists, and I have learned not to pin my heart on certainties, but hope is persistent and perverse. It keeps cracking the shell of despair until something green forces its way through. I survive because someone once survived long enough to hand me a wrench and point at broken machinery and say, "Fix it." I survive because my hands remember how to make things work. I broadcast because a voice returned to me once when I needed it, and I have taken on the imperfect, exhausted duty of being that voice now. If that makes me foolish, then I am the most stubborn kind of fool, the kind who refuses to let the world's last voices go mute. So I keep the microphone warm. I keep the generator fed. I check the water at dawn. I whisper weather and warnings, and sometimes jokes into the static because laughter costs nothing, and sometimes spreads like contagion, the good kind. I am not a hero. I am a maintenance man of hope, doing the ugly small work that keeps a few fragile lives tethered together. If someone hears me and decides to keep walking, or to plant a seed, or to trade a battery for medicine, then the work is not wasted. That is enough. For now, it is everything. They call it the Great Black Wave now, as if naming it makes it less monstrous. Names don't make anything less dangerous. They make it easier to point at, to warn about on air, to tell someone where not to go. The wave is not a wave of water. It's a wall of air, thick, heavy, and black, moving like a slow ocean across the land. It carries the ashes of cities and forests, the soot of 1,000 burning things, and the chemical ghosts of industries once proud and legal. When it passes, sunlight becomes a rumor, and the air tastes like metal and rainwater gone wrong. The first time I saw it on the horizon, I almost laughed out of habit, some instinct to treat the world like a reversible problem. It looked like a storm cloud, too dark, too uniform. The wind shifted and everything smelled wrong, like iron and old rubber. Birds dropped out of the sky in small, twitching heaps, and the dogs in the neighborhood howled and then went quiet. We have a system of small alarms. The barometer that screws into the old window frame, the smell that comes in like a wet rag, the static on the radio that goes thin and needle-like before the carriers collapse. You learn the signs. That saved some of us the first time. It did not save everyone. This is what the crisis is now. Storms of particulate and chemical load, drought that hollowed out our rivers and farms, and heat that made nights no safer than days. The systems that used to smooth out the weather, wetlands, forests, the slow percolation of water through healthy soil, were eaten away over decades. We greedily rerouted rivers, paved over floodplains, burned forests for quick profit. The climate didn't just warm. The whole hydrologic rhythm changed. Winters gave up their snowpacks. Summer storms stopped running along old tracks and started exploding in place. Firestorms create their own weather. Pyroconvective columns that fling embers across counties and launch clouds of ash that travel on high-altitude winds for weeks. That's how the wave was born. A century of fires and fusion of industrial soot into a traveling, suffocating front. Science says it in blunt terms. Black carbon and soot absorb sunlight, heat the atmosphere, and darken ice and soils that used to reflect light. Less reflection means more heat stored. More heat means drier soils, more lightning, more fires. Fires feed particles into the atmosphere that encourage further warming, positive feedback loops. Then there's the chemical side. Old factories and chemical plants that exploded or burned release persistent organic pollutants and acidic compounds. The wave picks these up, mixes them with the ash, and when it falls as dust or rain, it turns water into a hazard. That's why rain is no longer a blessing, but a decision, to shelter and lose whatever fragile scavenging you planned, or to risk corrosive droplets on your skin and wounds. For us on the ground, the science is crude and practical. It explains why wells go cloudy within days of a wind event. It explains why tin roofs blister and why a clean shirt becomes a sieve for soot. But practical knowledge is survival knowledge. Wear layered cloth and a tight scarf near your mouth. Wet it when the wave comes. Seal whatever shelter corners you can. Keep a sealed container for unaffected water. Keep charcoal on hand for filtration, because activated charcoal binds a lot of the nastier molecules. And if you can, bring any water you collect to a long boil after filtering. Boiling kills pathogens. Filtering removes particulates and some chemicals. Charcoal helps more. None of it is perfect, and none of it guarantees you'll avoid a slow poisoning, but it buys time. Survival is harder every day for obvious reasons. Fewer resources, more enemies, and the weather itself becoming an antagonist that doesn't sleep. We're counting on dwindling caches of fossil fuel to run generators for radios and pumps. Batteries die, circuit boards corrode, seeds lose viability in warmer storage. So the work of keeping things going becomes improvisation over improvisation. Cobbling batteries from dead cars, cannibalizing solar panels from an office park, and reconciling them to a cracked inverter, learning how to graft drought-hardy varieties onto whatever rootstock we can find. The things that used to be cheap, clean water, public health, a reliable supply chain, are now expensive, fragile, and political. Politics matter less in the formal sense and more in the small, violent sense. The old government mottos and offices are gone. What remains are nodes of power that coalesce around resources. You either join a group with rules and mutual defense, or you survive alone and accept the costs. I've met small collectives that run like careful cooperatives. They guard a garden behind a boarded schoolhouse. They share water schedules, designate scouts for scavenging, barter for medicine. They're organized in ways that mimic the old institutions, but stripped down to the skeleton. Kitchens, sanitation routines, watch rotations, and a sick bay that is more triage than hospital. Those groups are rare, and therefore vulnerable. Raiders and so-called reclaimers prowl between nodes, sometimes organized, sometimes ragged, driven by hunger and the adrenaline of taking.
I learned the rules of encounters the hard way. If a group approaches with open hands and too many stories, they might be trying to distract while others slip in. If they come at dusk and know exactly where the food cache is, they might already have the map of rumor. Watch their eyes. Watch how they treat children and animals. A person who shares loss without asking should be treated with care. I've had allies turn into enemies and enemies turn into allies. Trust is a conditional currency. You spend it and hope the ledger balances in human terms, not profit. The resource shortages are the tactile details that turn theory into terror. Water. There is never enough. I spoke earlier of my solar stills and shallow wells. Those are shrinking in yield. Wells silt up, pump seals wear out, the aquifers drop below the depth of hand pumps. When water goes, sanitation goes next, and with it disease. Food is next. Gardens fail under heat and blight. Canned goods may last a long time, but they are finite. Fuel is the linchpin for everything else: heat, pumping, radios. A single scavenger run to a distant fuel depot can yield a month's radio time, but the trip costs men, risk, and parts. Medicine is one of the cruelest shortages. Antibiotics spoil or are hoarded. Diabetics watch syringes become rare. Old injuries fester. I patch what I can with iodine, boiled water, sutures stolen from an old clinic, and practical bandages. Knowledge is our substitute. How to set a bone with a splint. How to reduce a fever with salt and shade. How to treat dehydration with electrolytes made from sugar salt solutions. There's a cold calculus to triage now. Who gets the last antibiotic? Who gets the fuel for the ambulance that is no longer an ambulance? Those decisions are knives. On air, I try to blend warning and instruction. There are about a dozen things I say every time. How to identify a wave, pressure drop, sudden light dimming, metallic smell. The importance of sealing shelter seams with plastic and tape. Where to find emergency caches the community has hidden, and where not to go, especially near industrial ruins that release toxins after a fire. I teach simple filtration, coarse cloth to remove grit, sand to clarify, then powdered charcoal or charred wood in a sock as an improvised activated carbon filter. Then boil, twice if you have fuel. I do not go into elaborate chemistry on air. Complexity confuses when hands must move. I give checklists: collect, filter, boil, shelter, seal, monitor, mark, barter, move if the place is compromised. The human dimension is the cruelest of all. People's choices under stress create cascading realities. A group that decides to hoard a water source will defend it violently. The ripple becomes a raid that then forces another group to flee and collapse a garden. One incendiary misstep, lane of vehicles abandoned, a careless fire for warmth, can spark a fire that generates ash for the next wave. The systems are interconnected in ways that were obvious in theory, but now brutal in practice. We are small actors in a planetary scale cascade. There's also a scientific detail that underlies a lot of our immediate problems: the loss of ecological buffers. Wetlands used to trap sediments, filter chemicals, and moderate floods. Forests held soil and water. When those are destroyed by real estate, by logging, by wildfire, systems lose resilience. The storms get meaner. The soil that used to sponge up water becomes hydrophobic after repeated fires and heat. So when it finally does rain, the water runs off in a pulse that scours riverbeds and carries toxins into places that were once safe. That's why we've seen sudden die-offs of fish, and entire river-dependent communities vanish in weeks. The old engineers who rerouted rivers didn't plan for the future we have. They planned for the profits of their time. We are also failing to keep up on the biological front. Pathogens mutate in crowded, stressed populations and break out in places with poor sanitation. Vector-borne disease moves into new latitudes as the climate warms. The medicine is scarce. That's an ugly fact you don't want to hear late at night when a child's fever spikes and the medicine cabinet is shards. All of this compounds into an everyday calculus: what to risk today for tomorrow's chance. If you scavenge fuel, you risk exposure to the wave or to raiders. If you save fuel, you let someone's wound go untreated. If you join a group, you may gain defense but sacrifice autonomy. If you trust a rumor of a working solar array 50 miles north, you may find community or a trap. These choices compress into each dawn. And then there are the lesser-known mechanics, the local symptoms that we, on the air, can teach each other. Keep a jar of sealed, boiled water for those first minutes after a dust fall. Keep bandanas soaked in vinegar for eye rinses if you don't have saline. Vinegar isn't ideal, but it's better than nothing for removing soot. Use damp towels to seal vents and block drafts. Leave a burner alight near windows to create a small convective pull that helps keep some soot from settling in a room small and dangerous, only when supervised. And mark your movements with brightly colored scraps to signal to friendly scouts. None of these are miracles. They're small acts to delay catastrophe. That is the crisis we live in. A climate-driven collapse that turned weather into a weapon. A scavenging economy where information and knowledge are as valuable as a can of beans. And a social landscape where trust is both currency and danger. The Great Black Wave is the best symbol of all that. One rolling demonstration that the world you knew can vanish in a day. We respond with grit and with systems of small kindness. A water-sharing roster, tools swapped for word-of-mouth medical care, a kid taught to read in the back of a bunker. I talk about this on air because someone needs to hear the layout of the land in practical terms. When the wave approaches, you need more than prayer. You need the steps that keep a family alive. Seal, filter, boil. Move if and only if you can. Never travel alone. Mark your camp and leave instructions for others. And above all, listen. Listen for the barometer to crackle. Listen for the voices that report where a cache was found or where a child needs insulin. Listen for the sound of engines at night and the difference between desperation and organized violence. We don't have a cure for the global processes that made the wave inevitable. That would take time and coordination and the willingness to stop doing what broke the system. What we have are small technologies and shared knowledge that lengthen our odds. Better filters, community gardens, rotating watches, and a radio network that connects someone who knows how to graft a rootstock with someone who has seeds. In this climate, knowledge distributed is survival multiplied. So when I report on the weather now, it is not just meteorology. It is triage, map, and plea. I tell people what the air smells like that morning, where the kids saw a line of dead birds, where a scavenger ran into trouble. I weave in the science because we need to understand the logic of the danger. And then I make lists, short, sharp, doable items. Because in the world of the wave, the ability to act matters more than the eloquence of despair. Every day when I flip the transmitter on, I am setting a small gamble against the spinning cruelty of climate and human hunger. I speak because voices have gravity here. They pull other voices toward them, and sometimes, against all reasonable expectation, they pull people toward each other. That is the only strategy I know that might last longer than the next storm. The days began to feel like they were borrowing time from each other. One dawn bled into the next with only the thin ritual of my checks to mark the hours. Generator oil level, bottle of distilled water, the small stack of filter socks drying on a line. The radio kept me tethered to people I never met, to news that mattered more than most headlines ever did. And yet the tether frayed. Fuel ran low. You measure fuel in minutes now. I would count aloud sometimes. 70, 69, 68. Like a man counting steps across a thin ice. A scavenging run to the industrial park yielded enough to hum the transmitter for a week. Maybe 10 days if I cut soaps and singing from the broadcast. But such runs cost tools, and each tool stolen or broken made the next run harder. Batteries bled to corrosion. The solar panels we patched together sent only fitful juice through cracked inverters. When the generator choked and went quiet one night, the silence that followed felt obscene. Suddenly the house was a tomb, and the small human activities, cooking, mending, the soft scraping of a needle shrank to the size of confession. I could feel how desperate I had been to keep the voice alive when the voice went dark. Water became a calculus of risk and ritual. My solar still sputtered with heat and gave up condensation in thin, expensive trickles. The hand pump at the well that used to cough up brown water every other day began to complain under the weight of rust. I had to decide who got full cups and who had to wait. I taped the ration board to the kitchen wall. 2 cups in the morning, 2 at dusk, less for me until the last can of powdered milk was gone. The board felt like an indictment of failure. Each time someone came with a fever or a limp, the tally moved and my chest tightened. And then there were the raiders. They came in patterns, sometimes a single truck with a barking driver who tried to bluff his way through, sometimes a pack of motorcycles that smelled like old gasoline and cruelty. One winter they came at night with ropes and a plan. They had learned the roads I used for scavenging. Someone betrayed the route. They hit the generator on the second night of my absence and took the panels that we'd managed to anchor on the roof. They left a note nailed to the broadcast mast. We take what we need. Give more and maybe we leave you breathing. Their handwriting was neat, practiced. Threats were always the neatest handwriting. I patched the roof the next day and spent the radio time speaking about where to find an extra filter kit and how to stitch a torn tarp. On air, I gave instruction and tried to sound bored about the menace, because fear broadcasts panic. Off air, I sat shivering beneath my patched tarp and listened for the sound of engines in the distance. The nights got longer in those days, not because the sun sank earlier, but because fear steals the small pleasures and leaves a lengthened stretch of wide-awake thought. Then the rumor began, because everything of hope here starts as a rumor. Someone called in on a cracked frequency and said, "North of the ridge, a place with running water, a greenhouse, and panels that hum all night." They called it Blue Well. The voice was young and low in the throat, cautious as if the word itself might scare the place off. I repeated the name on air and it took like a splintered fire. Messages came fast. We heard that too. Is it real? How far? Rumor is the currency that can buy a life here. You never take one without testing it. I tried to triangulate. A woman named Mara, who'd once traded me 2 bottles of Desal syrup for a soldering iron, called in to say she'd heard of a community moving seeds northwards that could be the same place. Another voice, older and thick with soot, said to watch for the blue kite flags. Old advertising banners repurposed, strung between 2 dead pines if you approached from the valley. The information came in fragments, contradictory and dangerous, because hope makes people reckless. The choice stacked against me. Follow the scent of a possible refuge and abandon the radio, or stay and keep the voice alive for whoever else needed it. The mathematics of the decision were ugly and irreducible. If I left, someone might take the mast and the battery bank. If I stayed, I might be the last voice and the last signal and then nothing. If Blue Well was real, maybe it had enough resources to trade for parts we desperately needed. Maybe it had medicine. Maybe it had children who could be taught to read without fear. The thought of that, kids in a place with sunlight and soil that wasn't poisoned, cut through the fear like a clean blade. But the truth about rumors is they are prone to become traps. Half the places I've chased had been scams or burned out hopes turned hollow by looters. My hands had scars from both the roads I'd traveled and the places that turned out to be lies. Then people started showing up at my door, figures who had been listening for weeks or months, and finally traced the broadcast to my building. They came with their own calculations. A man with a swollen knee and a steel crutch wanted to know if Blue Well existed. His sister had been taken by a fever, and he had a bottle of medicine in the bottom of a sack he would trade for directions. A girl no older than 12 brought a dried map, folded so many times its creases were a relief. She claimed it showed a valley with water. Her eyes were bright with the naive currency of hope. People asked if it was safe to go alone. I said it wasn't. I said it because I knew the roads and because trust was the only thing I could barter that didn't cost fuel. We made a plan the day after a raid stripped a neighbor's tiny cache. 4 of us would go. Mara, the crutch man, Tom, the map girl Rin, and me. We packed essentials on a scavenged wheelbarrow, 2 spare jerry cans, a blanket, a stash of canned corn, a pair of spare spark plugs, and a small sealed vial of insulin someone pressed into my hand at dawn. We also took the transmitter's backup battery because the logic was simple. If Bluewell was real, we could trade the battery. If it was a trap, at least someone back here would have a beacon. The road to the ridge was the kind of road that ghosts prefer, cut in half by erosion, flanked by telegraph poles that sagged under the weight of years. The air was thick that day, and the barometer, I'd left it clipped to my pack, dropped in slow, accusatory increments. We camped under a collapsed service bridge, and I taught them how to set a hand filter from sand, charcoal, and a bucket. Teaching steadied me. I found calm in naming small things and showing hands how to do them. They listened like they had to, because they had to. On the second night, a distant engine rasped too close, then halted like a predator listening. We lay still, breathing soft and flat against the cold. The bikes passed without seeing us. The men bent forward on their machines like people in hunger. They didn't slow. Once they were gone, Mara swore softly and said she'd seen such a pack before. Men who took women at the edges and left with both loot and a trail of grief. We huddled and the girls slept close to our small heat, and I realized how quickly the idea of family remade itself in the wild. A shared blanket, a guarded secret, a rotated watch. Rin's map was more hopeful than accurate. It had landmarks that matched, an old stone quarry, a rusted water tower, but also a line across the valley that didn't exist any longer. We arrived at the marker only to find a collapsed irrigation trench choked with ash. Tom cursed softly and pressed his knee. His breath came like a bellows. We found, tucked behind a slab of concrete, a rusted blue banner tied to a dead oak. 3 strips of cloth. Someone had been here. The banner's paint had weathered, but you could still make out the slogan that once hawked a soda brand. Someone had repurposed it and hung it in the wind. The strips of cloth flapped like faint, fossilized flags. At that moment, the world folded in on itself. We were not alone. A woman stepped out from the tree line with her hands bare and empty. She could have been a scout or a trap. She introduced herself as Lynn and smelled faintly of boiled coffee and soap. The real soap, not the ersatz stuff people trade for batteries. Lynn spoke like someone who had been given a choice every morning and chosen the better shade. She had a way of making her sentences feel like small gifts. She confirmed Bluewell existed, but not as an oasis. It was a cooperative of sorts. A solar-farmed greenhouse ringed around a brackish spring treated with charcoal beds and reed filters. They had a small school, she said, and an infirmary with enough antibiotics stored under the floorboards to keep a dozen people alive for a few weeks. Hope is cunning. It makes you feel as if you have been conserving for a lifetime and finally arrived at an answer. We walked with Lynn deeper into the valley and saw, through an ashy mist, the glint of panels in a broken sunrise. There were people there, dozens, maybe 100, moving in a rhythm that was not panic but chore. Children with sweeping brooms, elders with sun hats made from plastic, someone strumming a guitar that had survived some judgment. But Bluewell had rules. Lynn pulled us aside and spoke quietly. You can't bring everyone who wants to come. You have to show what you can trade. You have to pass a quarantine. And we do not let raiders in. We will kill to keep raiders out. Her voice was flat on that last part. She had seen what raiders did. We learned then that Bluewell had already been hit once 2 winters ago, when a band cut through their perimeter at night and took a greenhouse and 7 people. The cooperative had rebuilt, but the memory lived like a scar. The tension climbed. To enter Bluewell was to risk the safety of others. To stay away was to deny a possible lifeline. The moral arithmetic in those moments felt like the hardest kind of math. How many lives do you risk to save one? How do you ensure the security of a network without becoming the fortress that loses its humanity? Lynn explained their entry policy, an assessment period, gifts of value, not simply people, and a labor commitment. They wanted skills, engineers, medics, people who could fix and teach. I thought of the transmitter massed back home. I thought of the people who might be listening and counting on my pattern. Weather report at dawn, ration notices mid-morning, a music hour to keep the small ones from going mad. The radio was more than my voice. It was a map of trust networks. If I left and Bluewell rejected us, they could see the silenced signal and wonder if anyone remained. If I stayed and Bluewell was the place that could teach seed grafting and solar maintenance, did I have the right to keep that knowledge from people who needed it? Those nights before the council in Bluewell felt like a narrowing tunnel. I could feel the burden of decisions I had not asked for pressing into my shoulders. I dreamt of Lena sometimes, her voice sharp, accusing, practical. In those dreams she asked why I had not come with her when the city flooded. She accused me of loving machines more than the people who depended on them. When I woke, the guilt had the texture of salt. We were assessed by a woman named Harrow, who wore a band of woven metal across her brow, and had the slow, careful voice of someone used to negotiating between the stubborn and the desperate. She tested us for lice and scabies, asked about vaccination history, and inspected our tools. She asked why we had come. When I told her the truth, that I was a radio man and that my signal kept people alive, she nodded as if she'd heard that claim before and had considered it both mercy and liability. We need broadcasters, she said, but we also need people who will stay. That was the question that beat in my chest louder than any drum. Would I be willing to stay in one place, Bluewell or anywhere, for the sake of a community? The answer was both obvious and jagged. The radio is my duty, but duty had no obvious geography. Perhaps the network could be rebuilt with more nodes. Perhaps a teaching of radio maintenance and a donation of our backup battery could turn Bluewell into a relay that reached across ranges and kept the voice alive even if I was gone. Or perhaps staying would mean abandoning those who listen to this exact frequency, a small island of people who have learned to trust my cadence. The council's decision was slow. We waited with the other hopefuls while children chased each other with scavenged toys and elders braided plastic strips into belts. The tension eased and then returned like tide. In the end, Bluewell accepted 2 of us. Mara because she knew how to graft and coax seeds into stubborn soil, and Rin because the children had taken to her, and the council believed a child could teach other children to read and survive. Tom's knee was a liability they could not accommodate. He would have to go back. They offered me a position, but it was conditional. Stay and teach radio maintenance, keep a transmitter going for 12 hours on a rotational basis, and train 2 apprentices to take over. If I accepted, I could still do my broadcasts, but only from Bluewell, a relay point that would sometimes be out of range for listeners like the ones in the city blocks I had grown used to. If I refused, I could return home with fuel and parts they promised in exchange for my assessment. Either choice felt like a small and necessary betrayal. That night I slept poorly. The decision sat on my chest like a live thing. I thought of the massed back home, of the people who had trusted a voice that might not come back. I thought of the children in the cooperative learning to read and of Lynn's hands, scarred in ways that told of doing hard things without complaint. I thought of the man with the crutch and his sister's fever. I thought of the raiders whose handwriting was neat. Hope sharpened into a choice. I could keep the voice traveling across the ashes like a candle held in a wind, or I could move the candle into a place with more people and more light, and teach others how to hold it. Either would be a gamble. Either would change who I was. When morning came, I packed the backup battery into a crate and signed the exchange with ink made from coffee grounds. I left a note on the mast, 2 lines in my hand. If you hear nothing, we went to look for Bluewell. Keep a watch on the wind. We'll return if we can. It felt small and inadequate, but words are the only currency radio folks have. On the path out of the valley, I kept looking back. The cooperative's panels glinted like a promise. Behind them, the ridge rose sober and gray. Ahead, the road down to the city was a remembered wound. The tension had not resolved. It had merely reoriented into motion. I carried the choice like a compass. The rising motion is the part of the story where you begin to trade certainty for a chance. You learn the hard arithmetic of who you save, who you risk, and which small acts of courage might ripple into survival. In the weeks that followed, the story would teach me more brutal lessons about betrayal and loyalty, about what it costs to move, and what it costs to stay. But for now, with the image of Blue Whale newly inked behind my eyes, the world felt like it might tilt on a new axis, not toward doom, but toward a place where, if we learned well, the radio could be more than a voice. It could be the beginning of a network that stitched our small surviving pieces back together. We had a plan of a sort. Blue Whale's rules were a scaffold, quarantine, barter, labor. They had taught me to inventory risk like a mechanic inventories parts. It made me feel useful. It made me feel safe. Then the world reminded me that plans are paper and wind. The morning the wave decided to find us, the air was quiet in the way that quiet carries news. The kids were sweeping the paths between the greenhouse frames. The elders were folding plastic into neat bundles for the next patch job. Lynn moved among them, hands quick, voice small as a bell, organizing, comforting, telling people what to do even as she fixed a leak in a gut-stringed irrigation hose. The panels hummed with a thin confidence. It was the kind of ordinary day that makes you forget how thin the skin of ordinary is. The barometer slipped like a watched throat. First came the smell. Not metal exactly, but like a closed dumpster of burnt rubber left out in sun. Someone shouted from the lookout, a watcher up on the old water tower, and the shout multiplied into motion. Kids were called in. Tools were slammed into boxes. The quarantine tents were tied down. We'd practiced for storms, tarp the vents, run the pumps long enough to pressurize the charcoal beds, seal the greenhouse vents, soak the door cloths in diluted vinegar and salt. The drills were muscle memory, but practice assumes the only variable is weather. The variable that morning was a pack of raiders, arriving like a shadow with teeth. I heard them before I saw them. Engines, then the barked commands in a language all their own, short, precise noises that meant take now. Raiders usually shadow the aftermath of a wave for the simple economy of scavenging. Burn, then pick through. They're efficient. They're cruel. They'd learned, too, that a cooperative like Blue Whale had the rarest thing left, organized water systems. We watched them crest the ridge, half a dozen crude trucks and 3 bikes, silhouettes against the ashy sky. Lynn cursed and drew a breath sharp enough to be a blade. Harrow gripped an armful of tools like a woman ready to stop a leak in time. She looked at me for what felt like a vote. I knew the look, someone asking who I was going to be in this moment. The radio man, the maintenance man, the person whose hands still knew the geometry of wires and the language of engines. I checked the generator first. That was the wordless priority, keep the pumps running. We had for weeks. The charcoal beds needed constant pumping to keep the spring moving through the reed filters. If the flow stopped, the contaminants would concentrate, and the greenhouse would become a death trap. The pumps were on a 12-volt line fed from a bank of batteries and the generator. The generator could run both the pumps and the transmitter, but not forever. Power was a knife with 2 handles. Whichever you held, the other would cut. The raiders moved with the casual brutality of men who have practiced taking things without apology. They split into 2 groups, one toward the panels, one aiming to sweep the perimeter and probe fences. Mara and a half-dozen others took positions at the sheds with the crude bolt-actions and slings they'd trained with. Blue Whale had teachers, farmers, and mechanics, but it also had people who could throw a rock so true it broke a radiator. We weren't defenseless, but we weren't an army. I had 2 choices in 10 heartbeats: keep the transmitter powered and send a broad, waking alarm across the valley, risking that the raiders would trace the signal and hit us before the pumps finished their cycle, or cut the transmitter, divert the battery bank to the pumps and life support, and hope that the people who listened would keep moving without my voice. The decision was not smoky or noble. It was arithmetic and grief. Lena's face came into my head, hard, sharp, a silhouette from a kitchen window, accusing for reasons that had nothing to do with fair math. She had asked me once, whether I would choose a machine over a person. I told her I would choose what kept the most people alive. That was before the calculus had to be done with a single flipping of a switch. I climbed to the shed where the battery bank was housed, the sound of engines a low animal in my ribs. Mara's hand on my shoulder was warm and brief. She didn't ask. She knew what I was thinking because everyone there had learned to be the other one's mirror. The batteries hissed like caged things. Sparks had a scent I could read, the smell of insulation reaching the end of its tolerance. I had rigged a bypass months ago for redundancy. The bypass would let me split incoming power. If I diverted the feed to the pumps and cut the feed to the transmitter, the pumps would run through the night. The transmitter would go silent until we either reclaimed fuel or rigged another relay. The consequence was simple. The voice would go out. I thought of the people who tuned in on my frequency. Isolated blocks. A woman with 3 children. An old man in the ruined theater who liked when I played a scratched record. A crew of kids who'd learned to fix spark plugs by listening. I thought of the small acts my broadcasts had enabled. A warning that helped a caravan avoid a dust fall. Instructions that kept a clinic from poisoning its water. The radio was history written in air. But Bluewell was here, palpably breathing, and the pumps were the difference between the greenhouse living and suffocating in its own humidity. I made the choice like a professional makes a repair. Quickly, surgically, with no fanfare. The bypass switch clicked under my glove. Electricity shuddered. A low hum altered. The pump motors took the load. The generator throbbed and then steadied. The transmitter's lamp died in the next room like a small, obedient animal. The mast was still there, the antenna flapping a weak paper sound in the wind, but the voice was gone. Silence is loud in a place built on voices. For a moment I could hear every breath in the compound. Then the raiders moved. They hit the panel shed first, throwing a crude explosive that sent up a cone of dust and parts. Mara and 3 others answered with a volley that was more courage than precision. People shouted and the air was filled with different orders. Yell, duck, move. The raiders came like men who'd practiced panic and weaponized it into a strategy. Bluewell's people moved like a bell trying to ring, some clear, some discordant. I was hauling an improvised jerry can pumped to the intake, a second battery strapped to my back like a sacrament, because pumps must be maintained under load. If a motor overheats while fighting to pressurize a clogged filter bed, you lose flow at exactly the moment you need it. The raiders were past the panel field and at the edge of the greenhouses. Harrow stood with a length of chain, an absurdly domestic weapon, and she swung it like she'd swung it 100 times. Lynn, small as she was, moved through the chaos barefoot and clear-eyed, pulling children into corners, wrapping their faces with damp cloth. Tom, who'd been judged too infirm to stay at Bluewell, appeared then out of the haze, crutch abandoned, face white with a decision he didn't regret. He had traded his limp for a place at the fence. He moved like a man whose scales had tipped toward a meaning he had not planned. The raiders probed our fences, found weak joints and tried to lever them open. Mara had set traps, nooses that yelled, piles of broken glass, a thin string tied at ankle level that set off a bell from an old bicycle. They hurt more than they killed, which was intentional. Bluewell's strategy was deterrence and humiliation, not murder. The raiders were irritated by the noise and the missing easy pickings. Irritation makes men sloppy. We took the moment. We pushed. In that push, a raider found the generator shed and tried to pry open the housing. He understood, like a man who knows engines, that the meat of our survival was inside. He levered the latches and gave the housing a man's curse. I saw him smile in the way men smile before taking what they believe is owed. I ran. I ran because it was the only way to get between him and the life support. I reached the housing as he opened it and grabbed the crowbar with a grease-slick hand. We traded momentum. His weight met my will. He swung. Metal sang. We were a tangle of noise and sweat. The crowd around us had narrowed into two halves, push and resist. Someone lost a boot. Somewhere a child screamed like a shutter catching. In the middle of that mess, I felt something sharp and hot sing my forearm. A blade nick, quick and stupid, meant to intimidate more than wound. Blood ran down my sleeve, and I tasted it where adrenaline had made me salty. The world reduced to a hand on a crowbar, a belt strap slipping, and the knowledge that if he got the housing open and cut wires, the pumps would hiccup and the filters choke, and the greenhouse would become a kettle steam. I drove the crowbar into the housing with everything I had learned from fixing transformers in the city. The raider screamed and pulled back. He hit me with an elbow, and then his partner yanked him into the dust, and they ran for the trucks. They left because the cost had become too high. They left because 100 people had suddenly decided to be more dangerous than their greed. They left because, in the calculus of misery, this compound had become something that would not be taken cheaply. When the engines faded, silence fell again, different this time, wet with relief and with the sound of the pump steadying. The charcoal beds kept their flow. The reed filters kept their pressure. Greenhouse humidity held. Children hugged around a pot of boiling water, as if it were a bubbling hearth. I sat down then, my shirt dark with blood, a smear across my forearm, and I felt the weight of what the silence had cost. The transmitter was off in the shed, blinking its lampless sleep. Somewhere out in the ashes, people would be wondering why the voice had broken off mid-sentence. Some would panic, and some would move, and some would assume the worst. I had made that decision. It was raw and heavy. After the fighting, Harrow came and set my arm with a strip of cloth and glue scavenged from a clinic. She did not scold. She tied it and fixed the wrap like a professional with a logic that was both clinical and forgiving. She sat with me while the children hummed a song that could have been a lullaby or a warning. I could not tell. Lynn pressed a small cup of brewed root tea into my hands. The taste was bitter and clean, and for a moment, only a moment, I felt human in a way that had nothing to do with devices. That night, with alarms down and the children sleeping under patched tarps, I climbed the ladder to the water tower. The sky was abruze with a suggestion of distant orange, sunlight trying to be brave through the ash. I held the transmitter case in my hand like a relic. Its internal lamp was dark. I pressed my cheek to it and absurdly pretended I could hear the station's hum. Lena's voice echoed in my memory, not accusing this time but practical, asking quietly what I had done. I had cut the signal to save a handful of people who were there and breathing, and who had pulled in a stranger and turned him into a repair hand and a teacher. I had left silence out there, but inside the compound the pumps sang and children slept and seedlings in the greenhouse breathed. The choice had been made not just with my hands, but with the community's muscles and teeth. It was brutal. It was right. In the morning, we rigged a low-power beacon, Lynn and I and a boy named Saul who could solder like a saint. It would not have the range of the old transmitter, but if I trained 2 apprentices and if the cooperative made a policy of relaying messages, the silent sea could be crossed in steps. It would be imperfect. It would be slow. It was, at least, a network. I sent one message in the end, not the broad wake-up call I had once been, but a stitched packet of words for the handful who might be listening on shortwave, where the water was safe, how to make a charcoal sock, the warning signs of the wave, and the location of a relay we'd seeded 3 days earlier. I spoke plainly, not as a dramatic man at a mic, but as the maintenance man Jonah had always been. Clear steps, small actions, the math of survival. Then I signed off with a childish joke about a guitar string that had never kept a tune. It felt small. It felt like apology and repair. The turning point was not a single heroic strike. It was a knot of decisions that tightened or loosed with each breath. The flick of a bypass lever, the swing of a chain, the choosing to spend a voice for a pump. In the calculus of loss, we had preserved a garden and a school, and a set of seedlings that might one day become a field. We had also surrendered an old way of being, spreading a solitary voice across the ashes. But perhaps the world doesn't need a single voice anymore. Perhaps it needs many small ones, each learning to relay, to teach, to resist. As the days after the wave rolled by and the ash settled like an exhausted crowd, Bluewell stitched its wounds. The transmitter lamp remained off most of the day, but at night a small beacon pulsed, faint, honest, and full of the grit of people who had chosen to defend a shared water supply over broadcast reach. In the quiet between work and watch, I thought of Lena again, not as accusation but as counsel. "You fix what is in front of you," she would say. "The rest you do with what you can teach." That was the reckoning. The wave had come, the raiders had tested us, and we had answered with the exact mixture of stubbornness and care that kept a handful of people alive. The voice was different now, less universal, more networked. I had traded a wide signal for a living, breathing place. The choice would ripple in ways I could not yet measure. For now, the pumps hummed, the seedlings kept their green, and the children learned to braid plastic into belts. It would have to be enough. The day after the raid felt like the first morning after a hard winter. Everything was the same shape, but closer now, closer and raw. We stitched up the torn plastic, dug new shallow trenches for runoff, and replaced a couple of cracked reed beds in the filtration system. The kids moved through the compound like a small, efficient army, buckets, claws, hands that knew what to do without being told twice. There were fewer of them laughing than before, and each laugh felt like a coin spent carefully. The seedlings in the greenhouse had a thin, sunburned look, but they lived. That small green line was the nearest thing to a miracle I could point to and say, yes, this is real. The immediate outcome of the night was simple. Bluewell still had water. The pumps kept running. The filters did their work. The panels, though damaged, still produced enough to charge a few batteries. We had lost equipment and a thin band of security, and some of the elders had bruises that would not show up in the ledger of supplies but would last in the bones. Tom's knee swelled and a scab lined his calf where he'd taken a scrape. He did not complain much. He had fought and then sat under a patched tarp with a tin cup of broth, eyes like someone who'd survived a test and found the answer less exalted than he'd expected. Outside of Bluewell, the world did not stop at our fences and call us warm. The wave's ash settled into the crooks of the ridge like an old visitor who has nowhere else to go. The trees wore the ash like clothing, their leaves whispering like dry paper. Some of the smaller plants browned and held on. Others surrendered and collapsed overnight. The weather slipped into its usual indifferent cruelty, heat sharpening one day, wind coming in the next with a new taste of metal. Recovery in the sense people in the old world meant was not happening. Healing here was local, pragmatic, and fragile. A reed bed rebuilt, a new patch of soil fenced off from goats, a bandage applied and left to set. There was the usual tallying of costs and benefits. I had cut the broadcast to save a place full of people. The transmitter at my old mast sat quiet now. The frequency I'd once held a lonely flag over filled with the scratch of distant voices and a few different stations. Some people sounded panicked when I came back on the air briefly from the low-power beacon. Others sounded relieved to know that at least one person had left, and that perhaps a node somewhere else had a better chance if it was taught to relay. The network had shifted from a single voice to a set of smaller ones. That change was the real arithmetic of the aftermath. In practical terms, the network meant two apprentices, Saul and a woman named Myra, had to learn to solder, to tune coils, to listen for propagation changes in the ionosphere, and guess where shortwave would travel that night. They learned quickly. There is a strange hunger for skill in a world where everything else is scarce. Teaching them felt like handing children tools that could cut or build depending on who held them. I watched their hands and something in me relaxed. It was a small redemption. Knowledge multiplies in a way that canned food and bullets never do. Emotionally, the aftermath was tangled. Guilt is a stubborn animal, and it lived in my chest like a permanent hitch. There were people who had relied on that broad signal in the city blocks, and who now had to find other ways to survive. I thought of the man in the theater who liked my scratched records. I thought of the woman with 3 kids who had once sent me a note praising a story I read on air about a laughing dog. Did I have the right to cut that thread? At night I reconciled myself the way a mechanic reconciles a failed engine. You list the parts, you measure what they did, you accept that a repair sometimes requires a choice that breaks something else. But acceptance is a poor salve. The knowledge that choices hurt others sits with me and sharpens my resolve. What changed inside me was not a dramatic conversion. There was no single epiphany where Jonah the broadcast hermit threw away his tools and became a saint. The change was smaller and deeper. I no longer believed a single voice could carry the weight of survival. I saw the risk in centralization, how a single mast, a single battery bank can become a target and a vulnerability. That understanding shifted me from being a man who maintained a machine to being a man who built a system. Systems are ugly, slow, and bureaucratic. They are also harder to kill. So I spent my days turning the transmitter into a relay prototype, teaching Coyle winding at the same table where we boiled water and mended socks. If I had once been the lighthouse, I was learning to be part of a string of lanterns. Bluewell itself changed, imperceptibly and then all at once. The council rewrote entry rules. They formalized the barter system with a ledger kept in a tin box. They set up night watches and a schedule for when outsiders could be considered. They started a rota to seed relays, small, low-power units that could be placed on ridges and maintained by pairs of people. The idea was to create a mesh, one light nudging another into life. The theory was imperfect but hopeful. Redundancy over centrality. We also sent out scouting parties to place caches of parts, wire, fuses, spare capacitors, hidden under cairns and stashes by road markers. The act of hiding a fuse felt like writing a letter to a future that might be interested in technical continuity. The environmental picture, once again, refused to fit the comfort of neat narratives. Some places showed small, stubborn recovery, moss in a stone gutter, a sprout through a crack in concrete. Here at Bluewell, we coaxed a few species into productivity. Beans that could tolerate brackish irrigation, wheat strains that yielded thin but repeatable stalks, and a handful of heirloom rootstock grafts that held soil better. The broader climate did not relent. The ash remained in the gullies. The wave's chemistry had left parts of the watershed altered. A test we ran in a shallow pool showed elevated conductivity and readings skewed by salts. We had to treat and contain. We could not cure at scale. There were also decisions I could not undo. The man with the crutch, Tom, did not make it back to the city. He stayed at the Rangers crossing to help a pair of refugees who had been trailed by small, hungry dogs. He delayed them long enough for the two to escape, and at dawn we found him collapsed under a willow. The town's healer, who had managed to salvage a tiny bottle of antibiotic, did what she could. I read the body like a diagram of choices. He had become the kind of person who gave his place to someone else without calculation. We buried him under the willow and left a strip of blue banner fluttering at his head. I think of Tom more than I expected to, and in thinking of him I feel both a clean grief and an understanding of what courage can be when it is practical and small. In quieter moments I would climb the water tower and look for the lines of travel, the ridges, the old highway, the places the wind carried ash like a tide. I listened for other signals. A dozen nights after the raid, we heard a voice, thin at first, then steady, coming through on a frequency one of my apprentices had opened. It was a farmer's voice from the north, telling a story about a simple irrigation hack that let him keep 5 beds watered though his neighbors had lost half their plants. We taped that message into our ledger and added a note on how to replicate the hack. The voice was not mine. It was better. The question that lingered like a scent I could not scrub out was whether the net we were trying to weave would ever reach the people who still needed the old long-range voice most. Networks fracture along the lines of roads and time. A relay is only as good as the people who keep it alive. People die, leave, and sometimes betray. But building a net meant distributing the risk. I learned to be comfortable with partial success. My hands carry scars now that tell the story of the choice I made. There is a thin white line across my forearm, a souvenir from the crowbar fight. It itches when storms blow in. When I trace it, I think of the moment of decision, of the click I made in the battery shed, and I do not regret it in any simple way. Regret is not a single emotion. It is a ledger of consequences and a nudge toward better choices. If cutting the signal meant Bluewell's pumps kept the children alive, I will live with the price. People still send notes to the mast, taped to the metal with strips of plastic, updates, recipes, warnings, sometimes maps. We read them aloud during the low-power afternoon hour. We have become a community that shares not only bread but schematics. There is a new dignity in teaching someone how to wind a coil, and there is a new kind of prayer in showing them where to tape the connections so the relay will not fail at the first wind. As the days folded into weeks, I found myself less like a single disc on a map and more like a knuckle in a line. Sometimes I miss the singular clarity of being the voice, your responsibility concentrated like a point of light. But that point of light had been vulnerable. A single strike could, and nearly did, snuff it. The network is messier, filled with whispers and echoes, but it is persistent in a way that a voice alone cannot be. At dusk, when the children practice spelling with salvaged letters and the elders bargain over seed swaps, I sometimes take the old photograph of Lena from under the transmitter case and let it sit in my lap. Her face is small and bright in the paper. I speak to her sometimes, not in the hope of answer, but in the form of keeping a promise. I will do the work you thought I should. I will be useful. I will fix things. I will teach. The aftermath is not a tidy victory. We are patched and tired and alive. The world outside the fences still groans and breaks and surprises. The wave will come again in some form because the drivers of it, consumption, heat, loss of buffers, are not undone by a single cooperative, but inside the hedge of Bluewell's reed beds, in the slow and stubborn work of teaching a child to solder, and of showing a neighbor how to anchor a solar panel against wind. I see a durable kind of hope, the hope that survives not because it is grand, but because it is practical, repeatable, and shared. I keep the list of small things in my pocket now. 2 charcoal socks, a strip of copper wire, a note about where to find sealing tape, the names of the apprentices I teach. They are an inventory of what to do next, a manual for the next storm. If this is not a cure for the world, it is a way to keep the small human world intact in it. And sometimes at night, when the beacon pulses across the ridge and a distant voice answers with a local tip, I feel that the work has weight and a direction. That weight, awkward and demanding, has become my new responsibility. It is less lonely. It is harder. It may be enough. I used to think endings were neat things, periods at the close of sentences where everything made sense. Out here, endings are commas. They hit your breath and send you forward. We have no finales, only continuations stitched together by choices small enough to make your hands sore. Bluewell taught me that hope is not a soaring thing. It is a list. Repair the pump, teach the child to solder, swap an extra filter for a night watch. It is an accounting of small wins saved in a tin box and a ledger of debts repaid with labor instead of coin. After the raid and the wave, we rebuilt more than reed beds. We rebuilt a habit, the habit of sharing knowledge. Saul and Myra, my 2 apprentices, can tune a shortwave and wind a coil now. They still have the clumsy hands of beginners, but their hands remember. That memory is a kind of inheritance we can pass without passports or permission. I still sleep with the faint hum of a beacon in my ear. It is smaller now, faint pulses relayed across ridges. But sometimes in the night a scratch of voice comes through, and I feel the ache of connection like a warmth in the ribs. People send news on scraps of paper and recordings on cracked memory drives. We read recipes and wiring diagrams in the same breath. The children practice letters beside seedlings. The elders barter advice about when to sow beans. When someone laughs now, it is not a cheap thing. It is spent carefully, and it is worth more for that. Nature has not forgiven us, and the ash still rides the wind like a shadow that never quite leaves. The seasons are still weapons more often than blessings. We've learned to coax stubborn life from poor places, drought-hardy beans, reed filters, patchwork solar arrays. But those are adaptations, not cures. The larger climate that birthed the wave is a machine that needs large repairs, and people with time and resources we do not have. That truth sits on us like a horizon we cannot cross alone. There are nights I still taste metal on my tongue and imagine the old city full of lights. Those memories are not indulgences, they are maps. They remind me that systems took work to make and that even now, systems, small networks of knowledge and supply, take work to keep. Lena's voice is in those maps. She would have been furious I almost let the radio be everything. She would have been proud I chose to teach others. In my head, she nags me with precision. Keep your hands useful, she says. Teach the children how to mend more than their clothes. Teach them how to read weather and wire and wounds. She is the voice that keeps the ledger honest. We have losses that do not reconcile. Tom's grave under the willow stings when I pass. People still vanish on roads, taken by wind or band or plain bad luck. The network we build frays at times. Apprentices move, relays fail, batteries die. Those are not moral failings so much as the arithmetic of scarcity. We mourn, we fix, we try again. The cycle is heavy but not endless. My final message, or the closest thing I have to one, is this. Survival is not a single heroic act. It is a habit you teach your neighbor, an instruction you leave folded into a tin, a relay you rig on a ridge and maintain with grease and patience. If you can hand a skill to someone else, how to distill a cup of water, how to solder a broken joint, you have multiplied hope. If you can teach that someone to listen before they speak, you have multiplied trust. Do not mistake me. Hope is fragile. It breaks under weight and neglect. It does not repair itself if left alone. It must be tended like the seedlings in our greenhouse. Water them, shade them, guard them against frost and greed. The small victories are neither glamorous nor guaranteed, but they are cumulative. A seed saved, a battery spared, a child taught to read a coil. Each is a vote against the idea that the world has to end now. If you are listening where I once was, from a mast with your hands cold and your fuel low, know this. You are part of a larger arithmetic. Your small decision, whether to split a ration, to share a filter, to teach a neighbor to wind a coil, ripples outward. I chose to cut one signal to save a place of people. I do not pretend the choice was clean. But when a child slept that night and the pumps kept the greenhouse alive, I felt the weight of that ripple settle in my chest as something like rightness. We will face more waves. The climate does not rest. Raiders will try again, and sometimes they will win. That is the shape of this world, a series of skirmishes with chance and cruelty and sometimes with ourselves. Prepare as best you can. Teach as relentlessly as you can. Keep the small, useful things tidy and in order. Build redundancy. More relays, more taught hands, more caches hidden under cairns. The more places that know how to fix a pump, the less likely a single strike will silence everyone. If I could ask one thing of anyone who hears this later, if these words ever drift beyond our little mesh, ask that you not give your skill away to a single person and call that stewardship. Spread it. Seed it like the beans we trade. Teach someone to fix your radio and then teach them to teach another. That is how a network becomes a community and how a community begins to be resilient. I do not promise a sunrise without compromise. I do not promise that the ash will ever leave. But I promise that as long as people are willing to trade knowledge for bread, watch a fence for a neighbor, and risk a night to shield a child, there will be reasons to wake. That is my counsel from a patched workshop and a low-power beacon. Be stubborn about the things that keep life possible, and generous with the things that make others able to keep themselves. Tonight I will check the pumps, tighten a relay clamp, and teach Myra how to strip wire without nicking her thumb. I will read a note someone left at the mast. Someone found a way to repair a solar hinge, and we will add that to the ledger. Then I will put the transmitter on for an hour and listen more than I speak. I will listen for the farmer's voice out north, for the child who practices spelling, for the man in the theater who perhaps still keeps a cracked record. The world is smaller, meaner, and more honest than it used to be. It requires work and mercy in equal measures. I do this work because someone once did it for me, because my hands remember how to coax broken things back into service, and because, stubbornly, I believe there is dignity in small acts of repair. If that belief is foolish, let it be a generous foolishness. So keep your hands busy, teach, share. Watch the sky, but do not be ruled by its threats. Love the people around you in practical ways, feed them, bandage them, teach them. Hope will not carry itself. You will have to carry it like a crate of seedlings, careful and constant. Stay alive. Stay human. Keep the radio warm.